The wedding was supposed to be perfect: golden chandeliers, a string quartet playing softly, and a sea of guests dressed in luxury. But when the groom arrived, the music faltered. The man who stepped out of the old black motorcycle wasn't what the rich guests expected. He wasn't wearing a designer suit or polished shoes. He wore his scars, his leather jacket, and the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every mile he'd ever ridden. The bride smiled when she saw him. Her heart didn't care about appearances, but her father did. And before the ceremony even began, the air turned cold. Whispers spread through the crowd as the wealthy father-in-law approached, his expression carved from stone. "Is this your idea of a husband?" He sneered loud enough for everyone to hear. The groom stood still, saying nothing, the sunlight glinting off the silver ring tied to his bike's handle. It wasn't just jewelry. It was a promise, forged from humility, loyalty, and love. But to the man who measured worth by wealth, those things meant nothing. "You'll embarrass my daughter," he said, his voice cutting through the laughter and the music alike. The bride's hands trembled, torn between love and family pride. Around them, guests whispered, cameras waited, and judgment filled the air thicker than perfume. The biker didn't raise his voice or defend himself. Instead, he looked at the bride and smiled softly, the kind of smile that says, "I know who I am, even if they don't." It was in that silence, his refusal to fight back, that something powerful began to shift. People started to see what money often blinds us to. Dignity doesn't come with status. It comes with soul. The father-in-law, furious at being defied so quietly, demanded that the man leave. "You don't belong in our family," he spat. But before the groom could respond, the bride stepped forward, tears burning her eyes. "He's already family," she said, her voice trembling but firm. The room fell silent. Even the orchestra stopped. For a brief moment, the world froze between two kinds of men, one built by money and another built by honor. And when the next moment came, it changed everything. Because what happened at that wedding would be remembered for years. Not for the flowers, the music, or the wealth, but for what one man proved when he refused to let pride destroy love. No one in that golden hall expected a biker to teach them a lesson about respect. But that day, before all their eyes, he did. And the truth he revealed would turn their perfect wedding into something far more unforgettable. The guests stood frozen, torn between curiosity and discomfort. The bride's father, Mr. Langford, a man whose wealth could buy anything except humility, glared at the biker with thinly veiled disgust. "My daughter deserves better than this," he said, his voice trembling with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. The biker, whose name was Jake, simply met his gaze and nodded once. "You're right," he said quietly. "She deserves better than this moment." His calm words struck harder than anger could. The crowd exchanged uncertain glances. Something in his tone carried weight, a quiet storm that promised dignity, not defiance. The bride, Emily, looked at Jake with tears in her eyes. She knew what he meant. Jake wasn't there for show. He was there because he loved her deeply, beyond what money could define. He had once worked in her father's factory, an ex-soldier turned mechanic, before falling in love with the man's daughter. It wasn't supposed to happen, but love has a way of ignoring the rules written by power. They had fought for their place together, believing this day would unite their worlds. Instead, it was pulling them apart. Mr. Langford motioned to the wedding planner. "Escort him out," he ordered coldly. Two security guards stepped forward. Jake didn't move. He stood still, the light from the chandeliers catching on the steel ring hanging from a chain around his neck. The same ring Emily had given him when she promised to stand by him forever. "You can take me out of your hall," Jake said softly, but not out of her heart. His voice carried across the room, quiet yet unshakable. The guards hesitated. Even they felt something in the man's stillness, a kind of courage that couldn't be bought. Emily stepped between them. "Stop," she shouted, her voice breaking. "If he leaves, I leave." The guests gasped. Mr. Langford's jaw tightened. He was not used to losing control, especially not in front of his peers. "You'll regret this," he warned. "No," she replied, turning to Jake. "I'd regret pretending love has a price." Her words struck like lightning, tearing through the fragile veneer of wealth and status. The tension that filled the hall now carried something else, truth. Jake reached for her hand, hesitant but resolute. The music had stopped long ago, but their hearts beat louder than any orchestra could play. "Let's go," he whispered. But before they could leave, a voice from the back of the room called out, "Wait." It was the bride's grandmother, an elderly woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much pride destroy too many hearts. She stood slowly, her cane tapping the marble floor, and said the words no one expected. "Let him speak." The room fell into a hush as the grandmother's words hung in the air. Even Mr. Langford paused, unwilling to openly defy her. She was the matriarch of the family, and though frail in body, her presence commanded respect. "I've watched this family chase wealth for decades," she said, her voice thin but strong. "But I've never once seen it by happiness." Her gaze shifted to Jake. "If this man has something to say, let him." Jake took a breath, his chest rising slowly, as if gathering years of restraint into a single moment. "I don't belong to your world," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I don't have fortunes or titles. What I do have is what your daughter deserves: respect, loyalty, and a promise I'll never break. I've seen men die with medals on their chest, but emptiness in their hearts. I've seen love born in places where nothing else survived. And I've learned one thing: money can build walls, but it can't build trust." His words carried no bitterness, only truth. Even those who had mocked him moments before couldn't look away. Emily's grandmother smiled faintly, nodding as if she had waited her whole life to hear someone say what she never could. Mr. Langford, however, burned with humiliation. "Are you done?" he snapped. "You've made your speech. Now leave before you embarrass yourself further." Jake met his eyes calmly. "Sir, I'm not here to prove myself to you. I'm here to keep my promise to her." Then he turned to Emily and took her hand gently. "You wanted a wedding filled with love. Maybe this is how love starts, by surviving what tries to destroy it." The silence that followed was electric. The crowd no longer saw a biker. They saw a man unafraid to stand alone for something real. Emily's father felt the shift, the power slipping from him. In a desperate attempt to reclaim it, he raised his voice again. "You think you can love her better than I can protect her? You'll never give her the life she deserves." Jake's expression softened. "Maybe not the life you dreamed for her," he said, "but the one she can truly live in." And then it happened, something no one expected. The grandmother reached in her purse, pulled out a small, weathered ring, and placed it in Emily's hand. "This belonged to your grandfather," she whispered. "He wasn't rich either, but he made me feel like the richest woman alive." The room went still. The old woman turned to Mr. Langford, her eyes sharp. "Don't make the same mistake your father did. Don't lose your daughter to your pride." For the first time, Mr. Langford didn't have an answer. He just stood there, silent, shaken, and, perhaps for the first time in his life, humbled. Mr. Langford's lips parted, but no words came out. The echo of his mother's voice struck him deeper than he cared to admit. All his life, he had fought to escape his father's shadow, the same man who had once disowned him for marrying a woman of lesser means. And now, standing in the same position, he saw himself becoming the very thing he had despised. The reflection was unbearable. For a brief moment, his eyes softened, but pride, cold and familiar, pushed it away. "This is foolish," he muttered. "Love won't pay the bills." Jake stepped closer, his boots tapping softly on the marble floor. "You're right," he said quietly. "Love doesn't pay bills, but it's what makes the work worth doing. It's what makes coming home matter." His tone wasn't offensive. It was disarmingly sincere. "I've worked with men who had nothing, and I've worked for men who had everything. The only difference is, the poor men still laughed at the end of the day." His words didn't seek approval. They sought understanding. And something about that simplicity, unpolished, raw, real, cut through the gold-plated pretense of the room. Emily's eyes welled with tears. For the first time, she saw her father not as a giant, but as a man, flawed, scared, trapped by the very wealth he thought had saved him. She took a step toward him. "Dad," she said softly, "I don't need the world. I just need someone who would fight for me, not control me." The words hit like a quiet storm. Guests shifted uncomfortably. Some nodded discreetly. It was rare, almost unthinkable, to see power lose to honesty, but everyone could feel it happening. The grandmother smiled faintly, whispering to no one in particular, "There it is. Mr. Langford looked between his daughter and Jake, his throat tightening. His world was unraveling, not through rebellion, but through truth. "You don't know what life will bring," he said weakly. "You'll struggle." Jake nodded. "Probably," he said with a small grin. "But we'll struggle together. That's what makes it worth it." That single sentence, simple, unpretentious, landed with more force than any grand speech could. Then, slowly, something shifted in the room. The judgment in the guests' eyes faded, replaced by a quiet admiration. Even the orchestra, uncertain whether to play, seemed to hold its breath. Emily's hand found Jake's again. The warmth between them was undeniable, radiant even. Mr. Langford looked away, his chest rising and falling heavily. He wasn't ready to surrender, but he knew he'd already lost the battle. And in that loss, something unfamiliar began to grow inside him. Humility. The ceremony resumed, not as planned, not as rehearsed, but as real as love itself. The priest, unsure whether to proceed, looked to the couple. "Shall we continue?" he asked softly. Emily nodded, her voice trembling but certain. "Yes," she said, "but let's do it our way." She removed her jeweled veil and placed it in her grandmother's hands, choosing simplicity over spectacle. The gesture spread a ripple through the crowd, a quiet rebellion against vanity. For the first time that day, people stopped seeing a spectacle of wealth and started witnessing something genuine. Jake didn't have vows written on fine paper or memorized in perfect rhythm. Instead, he took a breath and spoke from the heart. "I don't promise you luxury," he said, looking into Emily's tearful eyes, "but I promise you peace. I promise that when the world gets hard, I'll hold you steady. I'll fail sometimes, but I'll never walk away." His voice cracked slightly, but the honesty in it was unshakable. Each word pulled the guests deeper into the moment, stripping away all pretension until only truth remained. When it was Emily's turn, she smiled through her tears. "I used to think love had to be perfect," she said, "but you taught me it just has to be real." Her hands trembled as she held his. "You didn't save me with money or comfort. You saved me with patience, with understanding, with heart." Her father looked down, her words hitting him with the weight of years lost chasing things that never mattered. The guests fell silent. Even the chandeliers seemed to listen. The priest smiled softly and nodded. Then, by the grace of truth and love, two things more binding than gold, I pronounce you husband and wife. The hall erupted into applause. Not the polite kind that fills formal weddings, but the heartfelt kind that comes from witnessing something extraordinary. The biker and the heiress kissed beneath the soft glow of 100 lights, and in that instant, the divide between their worlds vanished. Mr. Langford remained seated, motionless. His pride had built walls his whole life, but that day he watched them crumble. As the newlyweds turned toward the guests, hand in hand, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, shame mixed with admiration. He stood slowly, his hands trembling, and whispered something only his mother heard. "Maybe I was wrong." She smiled, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Son," she said, "it's never too late to be right." The reception that followed was nothing like the grand affair Mr. Langford had planned. The string quartet still played, but this time, their melody blended with the laughter of people who no longer cared about appearances. The rich and the humble shared tables, toasts, and tears. The tension that had once filled the air dissolved into something pure and rare, understanding. Even the most judgmental guests couldn't deny what they had witnessed. It wasn't rebellion they had seen. It was truth, raw and unpolished, standing tall in the heart of a man the world had underestimated. Jake spent most of the evening not basking in attention, but quietly helping servers carry trays and comforting Emily's younger cousins when they spilled their drinks. The same guests who had whispered insults about his leather jacket now whispered something else: respect. He wasn't flashy, but he radiated a steady kind of dignity, the kind that couldn't be bought or faked. The more they watched him, the more they realized that wealth doesn't shine. It glows quietly, like light in the dark. Emily's grandmother, the quiet architect of the day's transformation, sat at the head table, smiling to herself. "You see," she murmured to Mr. Langford, "happiness doesn't need chandeliers." He didn't answer right away. His eyes were fixed on his daughter and her new husband, dancing to an old country song that no one had expected to hear at such an elegant wedding. There was no choreography, no precision, just two souls swaying to the rhythm of love they had fought so hard to protect. For the first time in his life, Mr. Langford saw beauty without a price tag. As the night deepened, he rose quietly and walked toward them. The room fell silent, the air holding its breath. Jake stopped dancing, unsure what to expect. Mr. Langford stood before them, his face soft, almost fragile. "You've given me something I didn't know I'd lost," he said, voice low but steady. "Perspective." He extended his hand toward Jake. "Welcome to the family." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of surrender, redemption, and something that looked a lot like love. Jake shook his hand firmly, his eyes glistening. "Thank you, sir. I won't let her down." The applause that followed wasn't for the handshake itself. It was for the transformation it symbolized. Pride had bowed to love, and ego had made room for humility. Emily threw her arms around both men, tears streaming down her face. "Now," her grandmother said, smiling proudly, "it's a wedding." And for the first time all evening, everyone laughed, not out of politeness, but out of joy that felt unshakably real. The weeks that followed became the quiet proof that the moment wasn't just temporary. It was the beginning of something lasting. Jake and Emily moved into a small house on the outskirts of town, where the sound of his motorcycle blended with the morning birds. It wasn't a mansion, but it was theirs. He built a small workshop out back, fixing bikes and cars, while Emily began teaching art at a local school. They lived simply, but they lived honestly. And every night, when the sun dipped low, they'd sit on the porch and watch the sky change colors, grateful for peace that no fortune could buy. Mr. Langford visited one afternoon, stepping carefully across the gravel driveway in polished shoes that didn't belong in the dirt. Jake was under the hood of a car, grease on his hands, a familiar half-smile on his face. "You shouldn't work so hard," the older man said awkwardly. Jake chuckled. "Hard work's what keeps me sane." There was no tension between them now, just two men from different worlds learning to meet in the middle. Mr. Langford looked around, noticing how happy his daughter seemed. "She's glowing," he said quietly. Jake nodded. "That's all I ever wanted." Inside, Emily poured her father a cup of coffee. He looked at the chipped mug, smiled faintly, and said, "You know, I used to think happiness came in crystal cups." She laughed softly. "Turns out it tastes better in this one." They talked for hours, about life, about love, about the day. Everything changed. It wasn't a reconciliation built on apology. It was built on understanding. For once, words didn't separate them. They healed. The town still whispered about the wedding that had turned a rich man humble and a biker into a hero. But Jake and Emily didn't care about stories. They cared about living theirs. When neighbors passed by, they saw laughter, hard work, and love in its truest form. Imperfect but unbreakable. People began visiting Jake's workshop not just for repairs, but for advice. Somehow, the man who once stood at the edge of wealth's disdain had become the quiet heart of a community learning to value what truly mattered. On their first anniversary, they held a small dinner at home, just family. Mr. Langford brought flowers instead of gifts. His mother smiled at the simplicity of it all, and for once, the table felt whole. No pretense, no walls, no pride. Just people who had learned that sometimes the richest weddings aren't the ones filled with gold, but the ones where forgiveness, love, and truth finally take their place at the table. As the years passed, the echoes of that unforgettable wedding became legend in the town. People still whispered about the biker who married the heiress, but the story had changed. It wasn't gossip anymore. It was a reminder that love could cross any border, break any rule, and rebuild even the most fractured hearts. Jake and Emily never sought attention, yet their quiet life spoke louder than any headline. He repaired engines. She painted murals that told stories of freedom and forgiveness. Together, they turned simplicity into something sacred. Mr. Langford, once the symbol of power and pride, became a frequent visitor. At first, he came reluctantly, an observer standing on the edge of humility, but slowly, something shifted within him. One morning, he arrived at Jake's shop, suit jacket slung over his shoulder, sleeves rolled up. "Got room for one more pair of hands?" he asked. Jake smiled and handed him a wrench. "As long as you don't mind getting them dirty." They worked side by side in silence, the air heavy with the kind of peace that only comes after forgiveness has done its work. It wasn't just a gesture, it was transformation. The same man who once measured worth in assets began finding value in effort, laughter, and late afternoons spent fixing old engines with his son-in-law. Emily often watched them from the porch, her heart swelling at the sight of two men who had once been divided by pride, now bound by purpose. Every clang of a tool, every shared smile, was another thread weaving their worlds together. The grandmother, now older and frilier, would visit on weekends. "I told you," she'd say with a grin, "love doesn't need chandeliers. It just needs light." She adored sitting beside Emily, watching her paint scenes of freedom. A motorcycle cutting through golden fields, two figures beneath the endless sky, a house glowing warm in the distance. Those paintings began to appear in local galleries, inspiring couples who had lost hope in love's simplicity. Emily never signed them with her name. Instead, each canvas bore a small symbol, a silver ring on a chain, painted just above the horizon. And every evening, when the sun dipped low and the engines went quiet, Jake and Emily would ride out together, just the two of them, side by side on his old motorcycle. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the same way it had the day they walked out of the wedding hall together. "You ever regret it?" Emily would ask softly, her arms wrapped around him. He'd smile beneath his helmet and answer, "Not for a second." You don't regret something real, you just keep riding with it. But life, as it always does, tested them again. One winter, Jake was in a serious accident while riding home from a late-night repair job. The icy roads offered no mercy. The town woke up to sirens echoing through the valley, and by morning, the story had spread like wildfire. Emily rushed to the hospital, her hands shaking, her heart pounding in rhythm with every flashing light on the road. When she saw him lying there, bruised and still, her world nearly stopped. "Don't you dare leave me," she whispered through tears, clutching his hand as machines beeped steadily beside him. Days passed, long and uncertain. The town that had once watched their story unfold now waited in prayer. Mr. Langford was there every day, sitting quietly by Jake's bedside. He didn't speak much, but his presence said everything his pride never could. One evening, he leaned close and said softly, "You've done more for this family than I ever did, son. You brought us together. Now you fight to stay." It was the first time he had ever called him son. And even in his unconscious state, Jake's fingers tightened slightly around his hand, as if to promise he was trying. When Jake finally opened his eyes days later, the room filled with tears and laughter. Emily fell into his arms, her voice trembling with relief. "You scared me half to death," she said. He smiled weakly. "Guess I wanted to make sure you still cared." The nurse chuckled, wiping her eyes. "You're lucky, Mr. Dalton. Most men don't wake up with that kind of love waiting for them." Jake turned to Emily, squeezing her hand. "That's because most men don't get a second chance to live the right story." The recovery was long, but filled with light. The townspeople brought meals, the bikers helped rebuild his workshop, and Mr. Langford covered every medical bill. Not out of obligation, but gratitude. "You saved my daughter's heart," he said quietly one morning. "And somehow, you saved mine too." For the first time, Jake accepted help without shame. He understood now that pride can build walls, but love builds bridges. And sometimes, accepting grace is the most courageous act of all. When spring finally came, the sound of Jake's motorcycle once again echoed through the valley. The whole town turned out to watch him ride, not as a biker or a symbol, but as a man who had lived and nearly died for what he believed in. Emily rode behind him, arms around his waist, her laughter carried by the wind. They passed by the church where it all began, and Jake slowed, looking up at the golden windows glowing in the sun. "Funny," he said, "how the place that broke us ended up blessing us." Emily smiled. "That's how real love works. It turns wounds into light." That spring marked not just Jake's recovery, but a rebirth for everyone whose life his story had touched. The town held a small gathering in the park to celebrate the reopening of his workshop, now rebuilt with help from volunteers. It wasn't grand or fancy, just a wooden sign carved by hand that read Dalton and Daughter's Garage, because Emily had started painting the shop's logo herself. When Jake saw it, he laughed softly. "Daughters?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Emily smiled shyly, placing his hand on her belly. "Soon," she whispered. In that moment, all the noise of the crowd faded. For Jake, the world narrowed to a heartbeat, and a future he hadn't dared to dream. Mr. Langford stood nearby, watching with glistening eyes. The man who once tried to control everything now found joy in surrendering to what he could never buy. "A granddaughter," he murmured, almost to himself. The grandmother, still sharp despite her frailty, nudged him gently. "You see, Charles? Life rewards humility." He nodded slowly, realizing that for the first time in decades, he wasn't chasing success. He was witnessing grace. The family that pride had nearly shattered was now whole again, not because of wealth, but because of love that refused to die. As months passed, the once divided community began to mirror that same transformation. The walls between rich and poor started to crumble. Jake's garage became more than a place for engines. It became a place for stories. Veterans, widows, factory workers, even former business rivals came by not just for repairs, but for advice, laughter, and the kind of comfort you can't find in gold. People said his workshop smelled like oil, leather, and forgiveness. And maybe they were right. Emily, now carrying the glow of motherhood, painted a mural on the side of the shop. A massive pair of angel wings rising from an old motorcycle, surrounded by roses. Underneath it, she wrote a single line: "Respect rides further than pride ever could." The phrase spread quickly, appearing on shirts, bumper stickers, and even tattoos. But for Jake and Emily, it wasn't a slogan. It was a truth carved by hardship and held together by grace. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the horizon, Jake sat on the porch beside Emily, resting his hand on her stomach. "You think she'll grow up to be like you?" he asked. Emily smiled. "No," she whispered. "She'll grow up to be like us." The wind carried the scent of the road, the hum of engines far away, and the laughter of a future being built. Not on perfection, but on perseverance. It was then Jake realized that some love stories don't end with vows. They begin with the courage to live them every single day. Years later, the town would still tell the story of that wedding, the one that started with insult and ended with legacy. People spoke of how a proud man was humbled, how a biker became a symbol of loyalty, and how a single act of love changed an entire community. Children would pass the old church and ask about the mural on the garage wall, and their parents would smile, saying, "That's where everything began." And though time moved on, the heartbeat of that story never faded. It echoed in the streets, in the laughter, in the freedom of every motorcycle that rode through town. Jake and Emily grew older, their love weathered but strong. Their daughter, Lily, grew up surrounded by engines, art, and the kind of love that taught her to see worth beyond wealth. On her 16th birthday, Jake handed her a small box. Inside was the same silver ring he'd once worn around his neck, the symbol of the promise that started it all. "What's this?" she asked, eyes wide. Jake smiled softly. "It's the reason you exist. Never let pride make you forget love." The moment carried the weight of generations, and when Lily hugged him, he felt the circle finally complete. Mr. Langford, now older and gentler, spent his final years in peace. Before he passed, he asked Jake to promise one thing. "Don't let her grow up thinking she has to choose between pride and heart," he said weakly. "Teach her balance." Jake nodded, tears in his eyes. "I will." When the old man took his last breath, the family gathered in silence, not mourning wealth lost, but celebrating the wisdom he left behind. Pride had died with him, but love remained alive in every heartbeat that carried his name. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, the town hosted a celebration, not for the glamour of the past, but for the love that had reshaped their lives. Emily stood beside Jake, her hand in his, as the townspeople toasted to them beneath strings of golden lights. There was music, laughter, and stories, some true, some exaggerated, but all told with affection. As Jake looked around, he realized something profound. What began as a moment of humiliation had turned into a lifetime of meaning. When the night ended, Jake started his old motorcycle, the same one he had ridden to that fateful wedding. Emily climbed on behind him, her arms wrapping around him like they always had. "Ready?" she whispered. Jake smiled, engine rumbling softly. "Always." They rode off into the night, the headlights stretching like a ribbon of light down the open road. Behind them, laughter echoed, and the mural glowed faintly under the moonlight, a silent reminder that love, when real, doesn't fade with time. It just keeps riding forward. As the years rolled by, the story of Jake and Emily became more than a tale. It became a legacy whispered from one generation to the next. What had begun as an insult at a wedding had transformed into a lesson that outlived every guest who witnessed it. The once proud father became a symbol of redemption. The biker became a beacon of integrity, and the town itself, a testament to the truth that love, when pure, has the power to rebuild what pride once destroyed. Their story wasn't perfect, but that was what made it real. And sometimes, real is what the world needs most. Jake's workshop still stood at the edge of town, its walls carrying the laughter and scars of the life they had built together. Above the door hung Emily's old mural, now slightly faded by sun and time, but still radiant with meaning. Strangers would stop to take pictures, unaware that the man who often waved from inside was the same one who once defied a fortune to defend his love. Jake never told them. He didn't need to. His life spoke louder than any words ever could, and every sound of a turning engine was a quiet hymn to everything he had fought to protect: loyalty, honesty, and heart. Emily, now older but no less radiant, often told their granddaughter the story, not of the wedding, but of what came after. "Your grandpa didn't change the world," she'd say, smiling. "He changed ours." Because in truth, that was the heart of it all. Great love stories don't always roar through history. They breathe quietly through everyday acts of grace. They remind us that happiness doesn't come from having everything, but from choosing someone who makes even the smallest life feel grand. And maybe that's what this story was meant to teach. That dignity has no dress code. That love doesn't need approval. And that sometimes the people the world looks down on are the very ones strong enough to lift it up again. The biker and the heiress didn't rewrite the rules. They just lived by better ones. Kindness over status, forgiveness over pride, and love over everything else. And in a world still obsessed with appearance, their story remains a gentle rebellion, a reminder that authenticity is the most beautiful form of wealth there is. If this story moved you, take a moment before you go. Think of the people who have stood by you when the world turned its back. Hold them close, just as Jake held Emily. And if their story touched your heart, share yours below, because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that love still wins. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of what truly matters, and leave your mark in the comments. Because just like Jake and Emily, maybe your truth is the one that will inspire the next soul to believe again.